The Subcommittee on Oversight, Management, and Accountability will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on federal law enforcement training centers, preparing America's law enforcement to protect the homeland. Good morning. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. The nation is currently honoring its law enforcement officers as part of the National Police Week. I would like to take a moment to thank those individuals who risk their lives to protect their country and local communities. I also honor those in law enforcement who have lost their lives in the line of duty. In conjunction with Police Week, today we have the opportunity to hear about the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers, or FLETC, the component responsible for training more than 70,000 law enforcement officers and agents annually. I am proud to say that one of FLETC's facilities is located in my home district in Artesia, New Mexico. Artesia is home to the Basic Training Academy for the United States Border Patrol. It is also the training site for the Federal Air Marshal Service, Federal Flight Deck Officers, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs Indian Police Academy. All in all, about 4,000 law enforcement officers are trained in Artesia every single year. I recently had the opportunity to visit the Artesia facility and witnessed firsthand the full extent of work that goes into keeping that training facility running. Whether the training occurs in Artesia or at one of FLETC's many other sites across the country, it is critical that FLETC provide this training efficiently, safely, and most importantly, in a manner that effectively prepares trainees for the real-life challenges they will encounter in the field. The Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General, OIG, recently described in a November 2018 report some of the challenges FLETC faces related to a lack of resources and its dependence on partner organizations. For example, while FLETC's largest facility in Glencoe, Georgia, has an annual capacity to house more than 20,000 students, it still houses thousands at off-site hotels. Some of those trainees have been housed at hotels up to 74 miles away from the center. While this results in costs that are 3 to 4 times more than on-site housing, it also has non-monetary impacts. For example, one FLETC partner told the Government Accountability Office that its new hires who were housed off-site did not have the same opportunity to acclimate to agency culture. Additionally, FLETC depends heavily on the partner organizations that use its training facilities. For example, its partners are required to provide or pay for some of the instructors that run FLETC's training programs. Some of those partners rely on short-term temporary duty rotations that come at a far greater expense than multi-year rotations that also provide more consistent instruction for trainees. Despite these challenges, I am encouraged to learn that FLETC has recently developed a strategic plan, laying out a vision for the component's future. I look forward to hearing about how FLETC intends to implement its strategic plan, to work more closely with its partners to ensure that its training courses meet the needs of the Department of Homeland Security and all other partner organizations. I also look forward to hearing about possible solutions to some of the challenges FLETC faces and the ways in which this committee and Congress as a whole might assist in doing that. Training at both the beginning of one's career and as one continues to learn new skills and hone old ones is a critical piece in the career of law enforcement. And I am confident that we can work together to ensure that FLETC is providing the best possible training for the law enforcement community. Again, thank you to all of the witnesses for being here, and I look forward to your testimony. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. Thank you for holding this hearing. I am pleased we are doing this to examine how the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, FLETC, provides training and resources to federal, state, and local law enforcement. It's a very timely hearing as it is Police Week. This week we'll honor all the men and women in law enforcement and pay our respects to the police officers who have made the ultimate sacrifice in the line of duty. And I'm especially grateful because I understand firsthand what it is like to open a door and not know what's on the other side. All of us who went overseas to serve were able to do so because our law enforcement officers stayed here and served us day in and day out, keeping our families and our communities and our countries safe. According to the FBI, 106 law enforcement officers were killed in the line of duty in 2018. Line of duty deaths were frequently during investigations of a crime or while making an arrest. As we seek to reduce the number of deaths in the line of duty, we must recognize the important role training and research can play. Researchers look for trends relating to officers' injuries and deaths while on duty. Data analysis of these trends can result in changes to agency policies, practices, and training objectives for law enforcement. FLETC is one agency that is always looking for ways to improve officer training. It also conducts research to establish best practices. Since its founding in Georgia in 1975, FLETC has adapted to respond to the ever-changing threat environment and provide the best training possible. In the wake of 9/11, FLETC was moved to the Department of Homeland Security and has continued to expand its training opportunities to serve more law enforcement agencies. In 2018, FLETC trained more than 73,000 officers through over 800 training programs. FLETC provides basic training for agents and officers across the federal government and provides training on specific issues such as firearms, driving, investigations, and legal issues. FLETC also offers specialized training courses on things such as active shooter threat training, commercial vehicle counterterrorism training, internet investigations training, and tactical medical training for first responders. Recently, FLETC has developed a pilot program for training in human trafficking. I want to briefly discuss the importance of the last two. After the early experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. military began prioritizing tactical medicine. Knowing how to pack a gunshot wound, how and where to apply a tourniquet, and how to open an airway have been vital to saving countless lives on the battlefield. These skills are indispensable for saving lives at home as well. And FLETC's partnership with the Blue Campaign to combat human trafficking is something I care deeply about. We should do everything we can to eradicate this abhorrent form of modern slavery. My district in the Houston area is all too familiar with this horrific practice. It is no place in this world, and we must make sure we are doing everything we can to make human trafficking a thing of the past. FLETC also offers train-the-trainer programs that act as a force multiplier to increase the reach of FLETC and train as many officers as possible. FLETC's state, local, and tribal division provide opportunities for low-cost and no-cost training at its campuses around the country. These programs support the development of specialized law enforcement knowledge and skills. And additionally, FLETC sponsors training at other locations around the nation, most of which are provided at no cost for those at the state, local, and tribal law enforcement officers. FLETC clearly has its work cut out for it by trying to provide training for the federal government and being a resource for state, local, and tribal law enforcement as well. The executive order issued by President Trump to increase CBP and ICE officers to address the crisis at the border will require a large number of additional officers to be trained by FLETC. I'm hopeful FLETC can rise to the challenge, and I'm hopeful Congress will provide it the resources it needs to do so. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on the training opportunities FLETC provides law enforcement and ways FLETC can improve its training opportunities and the ways that Congress can assist. I yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
Other members of the committee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. I welcome our panel of witnesses and thank you all for joining us today. Our first witness is Mr. Thomas J. Walters, who serves as the director of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers. Director Walters oversees all operations related to the development and delivery of law enforcement training for more than 95 federal partner organizations. Before joining FLETC, he had a distinguished 30-year career with U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Next, we have Mr. John V. Kelly, who serves as the department's acting Inspector General. Mr. Kelly joined the Office of Inspector General in 2008 and was appointed Deputy Inspector General in 2016. Prior to joining the OIG, he served as the Assistant Director of Forensic Audits and Special Investigations at the Government Accountability Office. I'm going to briefly yield to Ranking Member Crenshaw to introduce the minority's witness, Captain Greg Davis.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I have the pleasure of introducing the Texas Department of Public Safety, Captain Greg Davis. Captain Davis has a long and distinguished career of public service spanning 3 decades. He began his career in the U.S. Marine Corps as a military policeman before serving in law enforcement at the Department of Veteran Affairs, the Texas Attorney General's Office, University of Texas at Austin, and now for the past 17 years with the Texas Department of Public Safety. I'm very grateful to Captain Davis that he's come here to testify today. I know how hard it is to leave Texas when you don't have to. Thank you for coming, Captain Davis. We really owe you a debt of gratitude for your service. Look forward to your testimony.
Not as hard as it is to leave New Mexico, but Without objection, the witness's full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statements for 5 minutes, beginning with Director Walters.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman Donna Small, Ranking Member Crenshaw, committee members, greetings to all. We, that is all of us at the in the federal law enforcement community, really thank you for holding this hearing. I believe it's been some 5 years or so since this Federal Law Enforcement Training Center has had the opportunity to testify in open hearing before the Congress. As we know and you've observed, that law enforcement training often runs in the background behind law enforcement operations, and that is altogether righteous and good and proper. But just as recruiting and hiring are important to law enforcement, so is training. And it's my ambition today to convey to you an understanding of our training strategy and our training operations at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, FLETC, and give you a sense of what authorities and responsibilities our community members reserve to themselves and what authorities and responsibilities the community members share. I understand that the focus of today's hearing is the organizations within the Department of Homeland Security that contribute staff, students, and resources to the community effort to train law enforcement professionals. For context, though, I note that every cabinet-level department in the executive branch, as well as organizations within the judicial and legislative branches of government, rely on the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center for some or all of their training. And they all contribute some level of staff, students, and resources to the community effort. Our community is grateful for the support of this Congress and every Congress since 1970 that have supported FLETC's training goals with appropriations, advice, oversight, authorizing language, and official visits to our facilities. My first association with the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center came as a young Border Patrol agent and instructor in 1978. I want to make sure for the record that's 1978, not 1878. I've worked as part of the FLETC community a half a dozen times in my 40-year government career, and since October 2017 as its director. FLETC is nearly 50. FLETC is, and always has been, a technical training school for law enforcement professionals. FLETC is part of DHS. As noted in our authorizing legislation, FLETC is led by a director who reports to the Secretary of Homeland Security. Our history began in 1970. In 1970, the federal law enforcement leaders of the day commissioned FLETC to do two simple things: to bring consistency to federal law enforcement training and to provide the means to develop and deliver that training. While the concept is simple, the execution of that concept is often challenging and never more so than today. Most of our training business is conducted for the benefit of the Department of Homeland Security organizations. That's about 70% of our workload. However, more than 90 federal agencies and many state and local organizations rely on FLETC for some of their training. For example, the Capitol Police that effectively provides security here in the Capitol also trained at FLETC, even though they are part of the legislative branch. FLETC and its participating organizations team up to train upwards, as you both have observed, 70,000 students every year. We operate 4 training delivery sites, occupying 3,300 acres in New Mexico, South Carolina, Maryland, and Georgia. You all have my written testimony and a copy of our strategic plan, but allow me to set some additional context. When I came on as the director in October of 2017, I looked around the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, and I found a lot more of the 1970s and a lot less of the year 2017 than I thought was appropriate. And so at FLETC, we re-examined our strategic direction, we refreshed our strategic plan, and moved from where we were in 1970 to where we ought to be in the year 2022. We developed and won approval for the strategic plan you see before you today. FLETC is an institution with a terrific past and tremendous potential for the future. We're grateful for the trust that Congress has placed in us, and I invite the members of this subcommittee and their staff to visit our sites to see what our community does each day. FLETC staff, many of whom are or were members of the organization they train, identify profoundly with the outcome of their work. No one's more committed than they are to preparing those entrusted to their care for the demanding and often dangerous challenges of the operating environment. I have every confidence, though, with a strategy to give direction to the energy, focus, and imagination of the staff. You can be certain that FLETC will get the job done. Thank you, and I will do my best to answer your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Kelly to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Torres Small, Ranking Member Crenshaw, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify about the training challenges at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers. FLETC provides all phases of training to more than 90 federal law enforcement agencies, as well as state, local, tribal, and international law enforcement agencies. In January 2017, the President issued executive orders directing DHS to hire an additional 5,000 Border Patrol agents and 10,000 immigration officers. FLETC faces significant challenges to train the 15,000 agents and officers DHS was directed to hire. Those challenges include funding limitations, impacted improvements to housing and training venues or facilities. Training venues and housing needs need improvement, and instructor programs need consistency. First, an increase in the number of students at FLETC will exacerbate existing funding challenges. Following the issuance of the executive orders, FLETC, Border Patrol, and ICE developed training plans and strategies to meet the hiring surge. However, funding limitations hampered FLETC's efforts to construct dormitories, offices, and training venues that support ICE and Border Patrol training. Second, FLETC's existing training venues need improvement. Border Patrol training venues do not accommodate revisions to the curriculum. This forces Border Patrol instructors to use workarounds that lack realism. For example, Border Patrol wanted to use a checkpoint venue that had a real bus terminal and use coach-style buses that actually cross the border. However, funding was not available for that venue. Therefore, Border Patrol uses yellow school buses and have trainees pretend to search imaginary storage compartments and imaginary bathrooms. This is a significant diminishment of the training value. Also, on-site housing was not always available. In fiscal year 2017, FLETC had to house 6,400 trainees at off-site lodging locations at a cost of over $5 million. For fiscal year 2018, FLETC told us it housed 9,200 trainees at off-site lodging locations, costing more than $11 million. Some of the off-site lodging was located up to 74 miles away from the training facilities, requiring individuals to commute roughly 2.5 hours a day. Finally, Border Patrol, ICE, Enforcement and Removal Operations, and ICE Homeland Security Investigations manage their instructor programs differently. This difference is most pronounced with ICE Homeland Security Investigations. Border Patrol and ICE ERO generally rotate instructors every 3 to 5 years. However, ICE Homeland Security Investigations relies heavily on rotating instructors every 4 months. Rotating instructors every 4 months is ineffective. Component training officials generally agree it takes a minimum of 6 to 9 months for instructors to become qualified. 4-month rotations do not ensure consistency in training and safety of instructions, which could lead to training degradation. Reliance on temporary duty instructions also is expensive. Using temporary duty instructors costs nearly double the amount to locate instructors for 3 to 5 years. In summary, prior to the executive orders, DHS was directed to hire the 15,000 agents and officers. FLETC's training venues and housing capacity were already overextended. Without corrective actions, trainees will be less prepared, potentially hindering them from achieving their mission and increasing safety risks to themselves, other law enforcement officers, and anyone within their enforcement authority. I am pleased that the Undersecretary of Management and the FLETC Director concurred with our recommendations, and has already implemented some of those recommendations and is working on correcting those other recommendations. I'm also pleased that FLTC received about $50 million in fiscal year 2019 for construction and improvements. This funding should assist the agency address housing and training facility shortfalls. Madam Chairwoman, this concludes my testimony. I'll be happy to answer questions from you or other members of the subcommittee.
I now recognize Captain Davis to summarize his statements for 5 minutes.
Throughout several years, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center has played an integral role in the development of training platforms for the Texas Department of Public Safety. Commissioned personnel of the Texas DPS Education, Training, and Research Division have invested in FLTC's training curriculum and diverse training opportunities, nurturing our continued efforts to provide our personnel with training of sound, relevant, and credentialed programming designed by FLTC, particularly in the areas of arrest control tactics, physical fitness testing and assessment, and vehicle emergency operations. Our agency has sent personnel to FLTC installations in Glencoe and Artesia. We have also taken advantage of FLTC's export program to bring training to headquarters in Austin, Texas on several occasions. During the last 14 years, professionally, I have attended and completed the following FLTC accredited programs: the Law Enforcement Physical Fitness Testing Coordinator Training Program, the Law Enforcement Control Tactics Instructor Training Program, all of which are accredited by the Federal Law Enforcement Training Accreditation, which is why DPS continues to send and take part in FLTC training. These programs have led to significant and impactful changes within DPS training platforms, which currently embed within the Trooper Training Academy and the in-service incumbent commissioned personnel. One of these significant and impactful platforms is the Texas DPS Physical Fitness Testing and Assessment Model. This new award-winning fitness testing model is sweeping across the state and nation and Canada. The foundations within the FLTC's Law Enforcement Fitness Coordinator Training Program inspired the evolution of this platform. As a result, we have been able to lower our risk of injury to all populations, to include boots on the ground, and garner support from risk management, legal, and EEO and ADA. In addition, upon request, we have continued to share presentations of our model with the following entities: the International Chiefs of Police Association, the State Police and Provincial Academy Directors, Law Enforcement Management Institute of Texas, which governs the Texas Law Enforcement Police Chief and Command Staff Leadership Series. Another impactful platform that FLTC has provided as a foundation is our Arrest Control Tactics program. Our agency adopted the FLTC Law Enforcement Control Tactics Instructor Training Program and fully implemented in both our academy and incumbent personnel. Injuries are a significant point of concern for all agencies across the United States, and FLTC has always done a very, very good job with looking at ways to administer techniques and applications that lower the risk of injuries to the populations so that training is efficient. Efforts by agencies to reduce the risk of injury, again, is the utmost focus. FLTC efforts to provide agencies of the state and local with training curriculums based on medical, tactical, legal, risk management, peer-reviewed, and relevant research is critical to the law enforcement training infrastructure. Of equal value and extreme appreciation from the state and local is the level of professionalism that proliferates through FLTC's administrative support personnel, staff, instructor cadre, and leadership. The environment this team creates is conducive to a healthy learning experience and a valuable relationship year after year. Future, in recognition of the IACP 21st Century Recommendations for Law Enforcement Agencies, the sixth pillar, officer safety, wellness, and health, as well as de-escalation directives, we would like FLTC, for the state and local, to continue its tradition of excellence in training by continuing to build programs and curriculums that nurture these recommendations and directives. Thank you for this opportunity to share. I'm open to questions and issues.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. I will remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the panel, and I'll now recognize myself for questions. In recent years, migrants crossing our southern border have shifted from largely single adult male population to more families and unaccompanied children. While FLTC is not responsible for Border Patrol curriculum, you do have a vital coordination role. How have FLTC's training programs, particularly for Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, adapted to the changing dynamic at the border, if at all? Mr. Walters.
Thank you for the question. The organizations themselves have some authority and responsibility to develop the training. Once they develop, they find a need and describe the need to us, and as we have a good record of providing the resources necessary for that. So as Border Patrol moved from a 66-day program recently to a 117-day program, they found the need for increased scenario-based training to fill that need, to fill that requirement. So they presented that to us as an issue, and we helped them design the facilities that we are building on their behalf to do that kind of thing. So as far as the structure goes of the curriculum, you're right. Border Patrol has a lot of responsibility for identifying what the training need is. They have a very robust Office of Training Development over in CBP, or at least it was when I left it. I'm sure it's very good now. But they develop the training points, and we facilitate that training after that. We work very closely with them. We meet with them at Artesia, which is the home for the Border Patrol Academy, on an almost daily basis to resolve issues and make the training better.
Mr. Walters, do you have any specific examples of that scenario-based training that has been added to address these changing circumstances?
Yes, in fact, the Border Patrol found a need because we now have sections of border wall that we didn't used to have. They've built models for that on our Artesia facility. We helped organize that and get that done. And they've built the training venues around that so that the officers in training are able to work in a realistic environment to help embed that training in their process.
I understand that the border wall addition, I think the question is more about the changing population that's presenting along the border. Do you have any examples of how the changing population scenarios address the changing population?
I don't know that the Border Patrol has tasked us to develop anything about the changing population. I know that they have adjusted their internal training. Of course, I just want to...
That's fine. I want to move on. I appreciate it, and I appreciate what you're doing there. Mr. Walters, every year FLETC undertakes the immense challenge of scheduling training for about 100 partners at 700 facilities for upward of 70,000 students. What impact do funding and hiring uncertainties have on your ability to schedule training courses for the year ahead?
Of course, I'm not alone in the federal government about the uncertainties of the federal budget, but it does have an impact on us that's perhaps a little bit different from many. Because I have to ask my organizations that participate about 18 months in advance how many they think they're going to train. And so for me, they have to predict themselves what the federal budget outcomes are going to be. And so I get about a 75% accuracy on projections. The other way to look at that, and the way I have to look at it, is I have a 25% error factor when I'm calculating what my investment should be in training infrastructure and just bringing enough staff on to manage the issues. So that's basically our issue. But on the good side of this, we re-examine our training schedule on a quarterly basis, and we make adjustments throughout the year. We don't set it in the beginning of the year and then never change. We change on a quarterly basis or more often where it's necessary.
And in the last time I have, has FLETC been able to accommodate all training requests made by DHS components or by partner organizations?
Yes, we have, over time and recently as well. We're pretty proud that we've been able to cope. We have a lot of different strategies to make sure that we get the training done. We never sacrifice quality, but we do have to work with the other two parts of that iron triangle of resources and time.
Thank you. I'll yield the remaining amount of my time. And now I'm going to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, a gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for questions.
The place that is very hard to leave. All right. Thank you, Chairwoman Torres Small. Thank you all for being here again. Mr. Walters, will you go over in summary how the recommendations from the IG's office are being implemented now?
Yes, thank you. That was really good work by the Office of the Inspector General. They have done some things for the organization with their study that I could not do for myself as part of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. The first off was the dormitory situation. And so what we've done is do hurricane repair. We were damaged, a lot of rooms were damaged by the hurricanes that came through. For the shorter term, we actually did double bunking to reduce, to maximize the on-base housing and minimize the amount of time that students have to be off base. And we were fortunate enough with a lot of support to get $19 million for a new dormitory in Glencoe. Now, the other part of that is we got about $21 million for tactical venues. When I say tactical venues, I'm talking about realistic environments where they, like investigators would operate, so we call it a raid house, a place they would go and do their business in a raid house, and a warehouse and those kinds of things. We also got $2.1 million for a training venue, tactical awareness center in Artesia, New Mexico. So those are the kinds of things we did to address those two pieces of the OIG report.
I appreciate that. On the issue of these 4-month rotations, has the question come up of whether to make this a permanent billet? I think you mentioned 3 to 5 years would be a normal rotational billet. Why is that so difficult to implement for some of these agencies?
For our part, at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, we set out an expectation. And that expectation is memorialized in a memorandum of agreement. In fact, most agencies have a policy that says they will provide training as instructors as requested on a 3 to 5 year rotation. However, with my background, and I think my friend from the Department of Public Safety in Texas would agree, that for the agencies themselves, their dynamic works like this. They have sort of the imperative of the midnight shift, I'll call it. Every investment in training is a one-to-one subtraction from operations. So they're reluctant to invest long-term, again, with the uncertainties of the federal budget, to put 100 instructors, let's say, at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center for 3 to 5 year rotations, when the uncertainty of the budget may be that they don't get the training. Now they've got the people there, but they don't have the training. So that's sort of the dynamic for our friends in the operating environment.
But they're still losing the people there anyway, because they're still sending somebody there for 4 months, and what we've all come to the conclusion of is it's rather ineffective because they're just getting their feet under them, they're figuring out how to be trainers, and then they're gone. So, I mean, you're still losing that personnel anyway, so it's just a bit confusing to me why we wouldn't do, this is effectively what the military does. We say, you're going to be a trainer for 2 years. Done, that's it. And that's the life you chose, so there you go. It would seem to me that would be a better model and much more cost effective for the law enforcement as well, but I understand there's internal dynamics. It is a different type of job, but we'll move on, and I believe we'll do another round, so we'll have lots more questions. But I want to ask you about how these courses are evaluated, the effectiveness of these courses, and do they change often based on feedback and changing needs, and how often is that?
That's a great question. So part of our process is to have the curriculum conference review on a regular basis, which is a set piece where we reevaluate for long-term changes in the training programs. And that's not just the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, that's all the participating organizations do that. On a quarterly basis, we look at more short-term changes that are required and identify those changes, nominate those. The agencies can nominate those. The Federal Law Enforcement Training Center can nominate those changes. Frequently, they come in the form of things like a court decision or brand new equipment that shows up that our adversaries might use against us, those kinds of things. But each agency head has the option to insert a piece of training at their discretion instantly, if not sooner, depending on what their need is. So that process is pretty responsive to the organizations.
Okay. I'm out of time.
Thank you. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Gentlemen, thank you for your service. Inspector General Kelly, the additional 15,000 professional law enforcement officers, 5,000 Customs Border Protection, 10,000 ICE. Let's refer to that as a hiring surge, shall we? Sure. So we can move on. One of the large questions of this subcommittee is regarding budgeting and you have enough money in the budget. This is it's a focus. We have to be protectors of the people's treasure and good stewards of the money that's harvested from working Americans to pay for federal services, including this hiring surge. The President's 2020 budget request almost $351 million for FLETC. Is that sufficient to address the housing and structural issues within the facilities?
I believe the answer to that is yes.
Okay, that was a direct answer and fast. I'll take it as solid. Director Walters, the Inspector General referred to some training challenges and venues. So while we're talking about the people's treasure and expenditures, I was a cop for a long time, a SWAT guy for 12 years, went through a lot of training scenarios. You mentioned real-life terminal environment. The Inspector General mentioned in his testimony, real-life terminal environment venue that the Border Patrol Academy was unable to produce, and they end up using yellow school buses for, I guess, linear assault training and search and et cetera. Where did these yellow buses come from, and why couldn't you get charter buses? What's the variant in expense there? To say that we were unable to use fully equipped coach-style buses, why not? If you had yellow buses, why could you not procure no longer in service charter buses for training scenario purposes?
In fact, for that particular issue, you're right, that the reality-based training, the scenarios that are like the environment is an important ingredient for them to learn how to operate in their environment. When the Border Patrol went from a 66-day program to a 117-day program, and they invested a lot more in scenario-based training, they made the active decision to go forward with what they had rather than wait for the resources. Sometimes, as you know, if you wait for the
They already had school buses.
We had school buses. We've been using them.
They're generally no longer in service vehicles that they're parked. How many of them do you have there?
I'll have to get back to you on the exact number, but I have seen at least six to eight. Of those
6, 8, 10, that'd be normal for a large training facility like that. And it just seems to me, again, regarding being good stewards of the people's treasure, that if you can purchase a yellow bus that's no longer in service, you could purchase a charter bus for realistic scenario training. And to build a venue, I'm not sure what that means. Can you clarify? Because it seems to me that the venue would be a large parking lot, and I'm pretty sure you have that in your training facilities.
Indeed, we do have a large parking lot, and we have some of that covered. Just to clarify, in the last couple of months, we did acquire a coach-style bus for the Border Patrol, set it up, got it air conditioned, and it is now in use.
Okay.
What the Border Patrol had envisioned.
Just the kind of things, the common sense questions that the American people deserve to know, and respectfully, I ask these questions. Regarding the 300-degree training, and you referred to that you're not able to build a venue to install that 300-degree training, and they had to use workarounds with one-dimensional training. That's similar to the old firearm training scenario, the old FAT system, and what the screen is, and you're talking about having screens that surround the agent for more realistic training?
That's exactly what they had in mind.
Do you have the software and the screens?
No, we do not.
Do not. So that would be the large expense, but you have the room to install it.
Yes, sir, that would be a
Does the
significant.
president's budget give you sufficient money to get that done? Because that's important. Current generation training is invaluable for a young officer coming out of the academy.
All of those pieces that were identified in the OIG report are being addressed. Some are already funded, some are requested.
Okay, Madam Chairwoman, thank you. My time has expired. Perhaps we'll have a second round.
Yes, I think let's go ahead and do a second round. Thank you. So I'll recognize myself again for questions. I want to circle back to instructors. I really appreciate the conversation that all of you were having with Mr. Crenshaw. FLETC's largest partners, U.S. Border Patrol, ICE Enforcement and Removal Operation, and ICE Homeland Security Investigations all have different approaches to managing and implementing their programs for providing instructors for FLETC. We've discussed this a bit, and specifically Mr. Kelly and Mr. Walters have discussed the impact in terms of quality of training. How has this impacted the cost effectiveness of training?
For instructors, as you observe, are probably the single most important factor in the learning that the student retains. Everything else is involved, but that's the single most important piece. So for the instructors, we try and get, an instructor takes about a year to develop. You take a subject matter expert, goes through all the learning processes, including learning how to manage master the content, the training delivery methods, to manage the classroom itself. So it takes a year for them to be a useful instructor, to be a positive impact. So what the cost savings there is, the most economical factor is to bring them onto the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, let us develop them, and then keep them there for 3 to 5 years. That's most cost effective.
Mr. Kelly, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I think the most expensive aspect of what you're talking about is the per diem and travel expenses associated with bringing people in for roughly 4 to 5 months. That's a lot more expensive than stationing someone to live down there for 3 to 5 years. And as Director Walters mentioned, the stability of the training is not going to be the same when you have someone cycling through for a short period of time. And really, the overall component doesn't get an opportunity to develop that trainer to be a better leader because they'll actually benefit from actually spending some time as a trainer as opposed to not getting that leadership experience.
Thank you. Mr. Walters, do partners consult with FLETC when making revisions to their training programs, including decisions about instructors?
The partners consult with us on the content of training programs. We have a memorandum of agreement with all of our participating organizations that defines our expectations, sort of a contract between us on providing instructors. Sometimes they honor it faithfully, and sometimes they're unable to do that.
Thank you. Just want to go back to the surge in hiring and the potential impacts. I appreciate your comments, Mr. Walters, in addressing that, and I wanted to follow up, Mr. Kelly, to see if you had any comments about the impact a hiring surge would have on FLETC's ability to schedule training courses to accommodate all trainees.
The surge is exacerbating existing problems. Right now, without the additional hiring, FLETC is having a difficult time making sure that they have the realistic type of training opportunities to provide the trainees, the students. That's going to get worse before it gets better. It's going to take lead time for the FLETC to both design the facilities and then have them constructed. These things are not going to go up overnight, so it's going to be a while before they actually are going to be at full swing.
And I really appreciated the comments that Mr. Crenshaw had about the training on active shooting. I was able to witness a training that was somewhat different, but it was a medical training that a Border Patrol agent had with a Border Patrol agent that had been fallen and had been shot, and the medical training that was provided to him. So we definitely see the value of this in the field and the importance of having that training. I wanted to ask if FLETC officers receive any other types of medical care training for individuals encountered by law enforcement officers or the officers themselves.
Yes, we do. At least in our basic programs, we have some of the basics, first responder kind of care, CPR, and those kinds of issues. But what Mr. Crenshaw and others were referring to is our our tactical medical training. And as you observed when we spoke the other day, the military's had that training for a long time. It's in terrific demand. It's really needed, and it's one of our most requested subject matters, and so we're spreading the good word on that, and it's been very useful. A week doesn't go by where I don't get some kind of notification from the field to thank you for the training that you delivered. The outcome would have been different if I had not had this training. So I think we're on the right track there.
Thank you. Now I'll recognize for 5 minutes the ranking member, gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw.
Madam Chairwoman, I'm going to continue along that line of thought on the tactical medical training. I'll move to Mr. Davis. And first I want to ask you, though, actually, let's stick with the medical training. Speaking before, you mentioned Texas leading the way on its own with a similar tactical medical training. I think you call it, well, I'll let you explain because you know exactly what I'm talking about. What was the acronym you all used? And explain very briefly how Texas pioneered this and got it down to the lowest level.
Yes, sir. So the program that you're referring to is the Tactical Emergency Casualty Care Program. It was implemented in August of 2015. What brought about that issue and provided recommendations and guidance was from a committee of the Tactical Emergency Casualty Care and from the military. And so this program and this course that was developed and then put out to the field, we have trained nearly 3,000 commissioned personnel since 2015. We've had 130 interventions with this application and saving 60 lives. Including the lives of 3 state troopers. Of the 40 life-saving awards presented over the last 2 years, 14 are troopers using the Tactical Emergency Casualty Care application. And we have trained numerous agencies throughout the state, but I just don't have any numbers on their saves.
That's okay. No, I think this is enormously important. It come to my attention, just over a year ago that not all law enforcement around the country even carry a tourniquet with them. This is mind-blowing to somebody from the SEAL teams and from the military or from the Marine Corps. It's imperative that we get this down to the lowest level, and so Texas did this on its own. FLETC seems to me like a very good partner on something like this, and perhaps now that you all know each other, we could take Texas's model and offer that to other states to implement as well. Losing somebody to a gunshot wound unnecessarily is pretty heartbreaking, and with the technology and training we have these days, that should never happen. And so I appreciate FLETC obviously having the right training at FLETC, but getting this down to the local level is enormously important, and not just for police officers, but security guards. I mean, the people who might be there first. This takes, you might only have seconds. Mr. Davis, do you want to speak briefly about the physical fitness testing and assessment programs and why that's so important for law enforcement? You had mentioned to me some very concerning numbers about life expectancy for law enforcement officers.
Yes, sir. So, according to the International Association of Chiefs of Police, CALIA, Centers for Disease Control, various opinions and surveys, what we see going across the United States at the present moment in time is an unfortunate reality. Okay, so we have situations where we have law enforcement as being recorded as the 3rd most obese profession in the United States. That's a concern. Secondly, According to Dr. Jonathan Scheinberg, who sits on the DOJ task force dealing with officer safety, wellness, and health, he is a cardiologist / police officer, so he gets the best of both worlds. We have an unfortunate report that currently the mortality rate for law enforcement officers in this country is 57 years of age. According to Centers for Disease Control, the average mortality rate for the male in this country is 79, and women are 82. So the question is, do we have a problem with a mortality rate of 57 years of age for law enforcement? And the answer is yes.
We do. And you get that training from FLETC.
Yes, sir. The foundation
bring
and
it back to the local level?
inspiration. Yes, sir. The inspiration of the foundation for the physical fitness testing and assessment model that we developed at Texas did come from the law enforcement physical fitness training coordinator program. It was an inspiration to me to launch a program dealing with VO2 science and applying a rower, removing impact from a testing model to keep our people safe during testing. That was one of the major concerns of all law enforcement agencies across the United States.
I'd like to move on to this next one. My last question would be, what additional programs would you like to see FLETC offer? What demand do you see from the state and local level that you would like to see at FLETC and be able to send your officers to?
Absolutely. As mentioned in my statement, the investment and the continued tradition of excellence, developing medical, tactical, legal research to back the sixth pillar of the 21st century recommendations, officer safety, health, and wellness, and de-escalation directives.
De-escalation. That's a good one. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Since we're on the second round, I'm going to go to our new arrival. So the chair will recognize the Congresswoman from California, Ms. Barragan.
Thank you. Gentlemen, I apologize for being late. I'm running from a markup at my other committee hearing. These questions are for, I believe, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, are you familiar with the Adelanto facility in California?
Yes, I am. We issued a report on that.
And who does the training for the officers that are in that facility?
I do not believe that is a federal facility, but I will get back to you on that.
Well, who's responsible for that facility? It's a nice facility, right?
It's ICE contracts out for a lot of facilities. I will have to get back to you as to who actually owns that facility.
Okay, but there's oversight of that facility, and the oversight is done by the Inspector General?
The oversight of the facilities is supposed to be done by ICE. We provide oversight to make sure that ICE and the components are actually doing their job. And on the Elantra facility, we said that they were not doing a very good job there. And it was, they had a lot of problems there.
Mm-hmm. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is who's accountable, who is responsible for when something goes wrong there?
Ultimately, if it's an ICE facility, or ICE contracted or ICE-owned facility, ultimately ICE is responsible for making sure that they comply with standards. We have reported that ICE does not do a very good job in ensuring that contractors comply with those standards.
Okay, what can be done when the contractors are not complying with the standards?
They can be penalized, and we've reported that ICE has not been penalizing the contractors for not complying with standards.
Do we set up the training requirements for these private contractors on what they should be trained on?
I will have to get back to you on that, but I do not think that ICE gives them the standards that they're supposed to comply with. Now, whether or not they're complying with it, ICE has inspectors, but as I mentioned before, we've determined, or we have reported, that ICE does not do a very good job in ensuring that people comply with the standards. So
Okay.
it's not surprising when we go out and do unannounced inspections, we find a lot of deficiencies.
Right. Well, just this week, this report, this testimony came out from a gentleman named Darwin Altunes Ramos. Mr. Ramos happens to be, and here's a photo of him, happens to be a gentleman that I slept on the concrete outside on the floor at the Otay Mesa Port of Entry until officers there processed him as he presented himself for asylum we were on a patch of U.S. soil, and his testimony now that he's there, the conditions there are terrible. He's being targeted, he's being verbally abused, he's being, lots of things are happening. People are screaming in his face, they're calling him terrible names. This is something I saw firsthand, actually, when I was at that port of entry, where you had officers, CBP officers, talking bad about migrants, right in front of them, saying basically things like they were criminals. And the reports that we're hearing from people at that facility is that they're not treated like humans. And I know that you have done a report on this in May of 2018 that outlines just some of the horrible stuff happening there, of people not getting access to medical care, of the nooses that are there, and the contractors there thinking it's not really a big deal to address it. And I'm interested really in finding out who's responsible. I mean, we're here talking about training and making sure our officers are trained properly. We shouldn't be able to say that, oh, because it's a private contractor, we're not responsible for the training of those contractors and making sure that they're treating people with dignity and humanly. Can anybody on this panel tell me, is there any training at all of any of our officers on making sure that people, migrants, are treated humanly, like people instead of like animals, which is what we are seeing happening in certain instances at the southern border? Can anybody tell me if there's any kind of training for dignity and treating people like humans?
I'll offer to address part of that at least. You know, our basic officers, for the training that the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center provides that we own, we have a pretty strong core in there of ethics, courtesy, appropriate behavior, standards of conduct, human rights, cross-cultural communications. For all the organizations, I know that DHS, my home organization, has a code of conduct. I know that CBP, my old organization, has a code of conduct. I know that ICE has a code of conduct, and in each one of those codes of conduct, they emphasize acting properly, acting as a responsible law enforcement officer, caring for the people. So I know that's embedded in our training in many different ways, but to the direct answer to your question, do we have something directly on that specific subject that's offered as an 8-hour block? No, we don't. But it is embedded in our training. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Inspector General Kelly, the federal law enforcement training centers have to handle training 15,000 additional American men and women. The training surge, as we agreed to refer to it as. To me, this calls for the training cadre at the training level, at the facilities. They need to be allowed to make command decisions and adjustments. They have to have the flexibility that they need to get the job done, to get the training curriculum completed and to graduate their cadets. One of the OIG reports apparently has stopped the use of a warehouse as a training venue. It's referred to a damaged warehouse that posed unacceptable risk to trainees and instructors. What kind of damage?
I believe you're talking about the warehouse that was at Artesia.
Yes, sir, in Artesia.
In which a automobile on a track close by to that, roughly 35 yards away from the track, went out of control and crashed into the building.
And how large is this? How large is this warehouse?
It's a fairly good size. I can't give you the actual square footage of the warehouse, but it was a good sized warehouse.
So in what way there was some damage to the exterior, the steel? Was it structural integrity of the building in question?
There was some. It appeared to be the structural damage. It did hit a beam that was supporting the roof. one of our recommendations was to go out and get an engineering study to find out whether or not that facility was, what was the structural damage associated with that.
What sort of vehicle crashed into this large warehouse?
I believe it was a police cruiser,
A what?
a police cruiser.
A patrol unit?
Yes,
A regular unit?
yes, it was,
So it wasn't a bulldozer? Or,
no, it was a automobile that someone.
so the training cadre had made decisions to use this warehouse for training, for simulation training, or what?
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. The
Were
accident.
there classrooms in there, or were they?
No, it was a warehouse.
Was this a large vacant warehouse?
It was a large vacant warehouse. The accident occurred, I believe, in 2009, and they didn't start using it for a training facility until 2016.
Exactly. This is to the heart of my question here, good sir. And respectfully, I ask. Of course, we don't want our cadets or our training cadre exposed to unnecessary risk. There's already risk associated with a 4-month training block of instruction. It's incredibly challenging and difficult. There's inherent risks and dangers. But it seems to me that if we're going to get 15,000 men and women trained in this training surge, the training cadre needs to be able to make simple decisions. If you're in you have a 10,000-foot warehouse, square foot warehouse, stay away from that part that got hit by a car. In the meantime, we're conducting our training. Do you envision this type of restriction from the OIG as impacting the FLETC's ability to train these 15,000 men and women? And should they not have more flexibility at the training cadre command level to make common sense decisions? And I'll leave you to answer that, good sir.
The FLETC has been very responsive to our recommendations. All of the recommendations that we've made, they have either actually fully implemented or are in the process of implementing them. So I think our relationship.
Let me ask Mr. Walters, not to cut you off, and thank you for clarifying that, Inspector General. Mr. Walters, wouldn't the training cadre on the ground have been able to you're talking about complying with OIG recommendations? Of course, you pretty much have to if it involves some sort of a safety assessment, but wouldn't your training cadre on the ground have made that decision before they started using this facility to train scenarios in?
We could have done better in deciding to use that warehouse. We didn't realize that it had some structural damage. The damage that was apparent was not structural in nature as far as we could tell. So it sat unused from 2009 until Border Patrol requested to use it.
Okay, well, just in my remaining few seconds, yes or no, does your training cadre have the flexibility it needs to get the job done?
Yes, I think we do, sir.
Thank you, sir. Madam Chairwoman, thank you. Time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. If folks are interested, we'll do one more round. Anyone? Okay. Okay. Appreciate you. Thank you. Mine, I won't use the whole 5 minutes, but I'll recognize myself for questions. Mr. Walters, the last thing you said was really enlightening to me. You said sometimes the partners consult about decisions made on instructors, and sometimes they aren't able to. Is there anything that we can do in Congress to support this necessary consultation with FLETC on instructors?
I believe there is some things that can be done. I think the organizations themselves agree that providing instructors the proper way and the proper amount of time and having them fully prepared is the right thing to do. Our memorandums of agreement we have with all the different organizations also agree. What would be helpful is for all of the, not just to pick on the DHS components, but if you're going to train at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, it would be beneficial to have all of your programs and your academy accredited with an independent accrediting body. We do that at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. We don't certify ourselves. We work through the Federal Law Enforcement Training Accreditation Board, which is independent. We house them. We provide some support as we would other participating organizations, but they are independent. That helps to lend discipline to the process. What it really does is focus the organizations on honoring their own training policies. It makes their decisions to do or not to do accountable. Who made the decision? When did they make it? Why did they make it? It doesn't constrain them in any way, but it makes them accountable, and I think that's a good thing.
Thank you, Mr. Walters. Mr. Davis, I saw you nodding your head in agreement. Would you be willing to comment on that?
That's one of the reasons why we seek out training from FLETC is because of that accreditation. It is so critical because you don't see it across the United States on this level. So to have the federal law enforcement training accreditation there to help with influencing policy and making sound decisions regarding policy and language, we want to seek consistency and continuity across the board so we're functionally operational.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. Kelly, are there any partners with FLETC that you've currently identified as models for the way that they utilize instructors and specifically instructor time?
I think the report would indicate that CBP does a pretty good job, and ICE ERO does a better job in between the two ICE components. So I think that would be the better one. I think we still have some significant problems with HSI, who cycles their instructors every 4 months. That does not seem to be either cost-effective or provide good training.
Thank you, and I'll yield the rest of my time and recognize Mr. Crenshaw, the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I want to go to you, Mr. Walters. How with so many partners and so many local and state law enforcement agencies that would want to utilize FLETC training, how do you prioritize which agencies will receive training at any given time? How long is the wait list?
We have a wait list at the far end for the lower priority training, but our highest priority is always basic training. So we have some subunits of that. Center basic training, the programs I run, not surprisingly, I prioritize those programs. Not because I own them, but because all our participating organizations, many of them use those as a core for their follow-on schools. Next will be the agency basic programs, and after that we do center advanced, that is advanced training programs.
What I'm trying to get at is, so if Department of Public Safety in Texas is trying to get into one of your courses, how easy is it for them? And maybe, Mr. Davis, you can answer that really quick, and then I'll come back to get an idea of what the demand is out there, and is it even close to possible to fill it?
During the last 14 years, when the courses have come up, we've put in for it, and we've been very successful in getting in. So we haven't had too much delay.
Okay.
So if I can add on to that, that we have 800,000 state and locals out there that could benefit from some or part of our training. Mm-hmm. What we're trying to do is maximize their access to our federal programs. We develop the trainings for the feds, and we make them available to everyone else in the United States if we can. So we're going to a new model of train-the-trainers that will expand our outreach to them. And I think it's a great model, and it will, for Texas and every other place, expand our access to that.
Okay. I want to move on to human trafficking training. I know FLETC has started to develop this kind of training and encouraging officers, or training officers with the ability to note potential human trafficking victims and prevent that. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then, Mr. Davis, after Mr. Walters, will you talk about how Texas does it as well?
So human trafficking, it has a transnational component, but that's not the only component. So we deal with it in two ways. We prepare our law enforcement officers to do their law enforcement job when they recognize human trafficking. But the other part of that is for the general public, especially other public officials, some law enforcement, and others that just work in the community, to recognize the signs that human trafficking is taking place and who to call. It's fairly simple, but it's an effective program. We get a lot of response on it, and it's in demand, and properly so.
We're talking a 2-day program, I believe. Is that?
We
it's not very long.
we have a program that we're running next week, a pilot program in Charleston, South Carolina facility, and then we'll pilot that again in a local site, and then we'll expand it out nationwide.
And Mr. Davis, would you like to expand on that, on how Texas DPS trains its officers to recognize these? I mean, I was on the border for just a day not too long ago. 14 kids were with adults that were not their parents. So it's very obvious that our asylum process is abused and used, and it's well known that a child can be taken as basically your ticket across the border. How do we figure out who's who?
As far as the Texas Department of Public Safety, that particular concept is one of high priority in our agency, and that training begins at the trooper training level, and it consistently is reinforced once they're out of the academy, well into the field in their in-service programs. So that's why we're very effective at doing that operation, but it is one of our major priorities.
Okay, thank you. I just want to emphasize again how important that part is. Houston, where my district is a hub for human trafficking, and we're not proud of that fact. And so we're thankful to law enforcement for doing everything it can to train officers to be able to observe and detect and deter and prevent it. So thank you. I yield.
Thank you. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Barragan.
So I want to follow up on the initial line of questioning. I think in the first line, we established there is no training for officers on treating people with dignity and respect and as humans. And it's kind of sad that we even have to have this conversation, that there should be that training. But after the human rights violations we see happening at some of these facilities, I think it's critical. I'm curious if anybody in the panel, just by a yes or no question, are officers trained, and specifically I want to know about CBP officers and ICE officers. Are either of those officers trained that migrants coming over applying for asylum are to be treated as criminals, or are they, criminals are generally treated to be punished? And what I'm trying to get at is, are they trained to punish, or are they trained in a different manner, say, because they're only in civil detention, just to be treated like they're detainees and not criminals? Anybody on the panel? It doesn't have to be a long answer. It's just, are they trained to punish?
They're definitely not trained to punish. Now I can talk about the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center's basic training programs.
Well, I'm
shared
interested in just
responsibility.
ICE and CBP, because I have some more questions I want to get to.
Right, but they'd be the proper place for that, to ask that question about the specifics, because they have a huge responsibility and authority to develop that kind of training and develop the culture for their organization.
Mr. Kelly, would you say that the detainees at Adelanto are people that should be punished?
The answer to that is no. Most of them are there civilly, so they're not supposed to be punished.
Okay, and then what I want to do is I want to read some scenarios, and I want to know where in the training that might be addressed so that this doesn't happen. And so where in the training this might happen. So let's say you have a detainee in ICE, and they're placed into disciplinary segregation, but there is no disciplinary hearing panel, which is actually what's required before placing a detainee in segregation. Now, when that doesn't happen, the detainee's right to due process is violated. Where in the training that's provided to officers do they get on making sure that they get that hearing before violating their due process rights? Anybody know? Mr. Kelly?
We have reported as being a significant problem.
Right, and what I'm asking is, what part of the training does an officer get? Where is that in the training so that they're told of the rules so they're not doing this? I know it's happening, and your own report says it's happening, which is a huge concern for me. So what I'm trying to figure out, where in the training does that happen so an officer knows, hey, by the way, this is a no-no, you can't do this?
That answer probably should be at either CBP or ICE, the entity that's actually performing that.
But is there any training and are you aware of any training that's being provided to any of our officers on that?
I am not aware, but I don't think I would ordinarily be aware of exactly what specifically type of training they're receiving.
Okay, so here's another scenario. We have a disabled detainee who's basically being placed in disciplinary segregation, and this disabled detainee is in a wheelchair and is taken into his cell, and he's left there for 9 days. The detainee never leaves his wheelchair to sleep in a bed or brush his teeth. Medical staff simply walks by and they rubber stamp that they've evaluated him as required by the ICE standards. Obviously, this is wrong, and this is happening as is indicated in the Inspector General's report. Anybody know in the training where officers are being told that this also is wrong and shouldn't be happening? Nobody. Okay, well, let's go to this other scenario. Detainees are in disciplinary segregation and they're improperly handcuffed and shackled. According to the Inspector General's report, that's not supposed to be happening either. Does anybody know in the training of officers where they're told that that's not supposed to be happening? Okay, nobody knows. Last thing I want to just end in real quickly is there have been reports, video evidence reports of ICE officers stopping people in their cars and asking for papers, asking for a number of things. I'm aware of the rules that within 100 miles of a border you're allowed to do that. But some of these videos are indicating that officers are not having they don't really have the right to harass and continue to detain people and asking for papers. Does anybody know what part of the training that federal officers received, either ICE or CBP, on when they can ask for papers and continue to harass and lie people into making them try to provide something?
Let me try and address that. From my CBP experience, and I spent a lot of time there, I know that the use of the interaction with the citizenry and the rules behind that, what the immigration laws allow, what the court decisions on that are taught very robustly, I guess it would be a phrase, in the basic training program for CBP for sure, and I assume ICE as well, but that's just an assumption on my part. My experience in CBP, so when I left in 2014, they were teaching it, and I assume that they still are.
I apologize, the gentlewoman's time has expired.
Great, thank you.
I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objection, the committee record shall be kept open for 10 days. Hearing no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned.